welcome back to the third part of our lecture. Having looked south to the United States and the situation there as it concerns crime and punishment, we now turn to our own backyard and examine this topic as it relates to Canada. We'll try to make some comparisons between the two countries, mainly looking for broad themes that might show both some similarities and differences. One important distinction between the two nations rests in the powers of the federal governments. In Canada, jurisdiction over the establishment of criminal law rests with the federal government in Ottawa. The provinces are responsible for enforcing the law, and for most criminal offenses, the federal government also delegates responsibility for prosecuting offenders to the provinces. That said, because of the overarching role played by the federal government in Canada, there is not the same degree of variation in the creation and execution of criminal laws as we saw in the case of the United States. Remember, there, the individual states had considerable authority to legislate on such things as prison sentences. Crime rates in Canada have followed a trajectory quite similar to those seen in the US. Beginning in the early 90s, the crime rate began to fall, and it has generally continued to do so. In fact, in 2013, the police-reported crime rate was the lowest recorded rate since 1969. In 2013, there were just under 2.1 million police-reported criminal code and federal statute offenses. This is 146,000 fewer than the previous year and marks a decrease of 33% over the course of the previous decade. As in the US, where statistical analysis of crime is typically developed to distinguish between violent and property-type crime, Statistics Canada also attempts to give some sense of the degree of violence associated with crime. The Crime Severity Index, or CSI, is used to take into account not only the volume of crime that is measured by the traditional crime rate, but also the seriousness of the crimes committed. We can see from this graph that from 1998 onwards, whether the traditional crime rate or the CSI is used to measure crime, there is still a downward trajectory. As in the US, there is regional variation in crime. One thing is generally consistent though. Across Canada, regardless of province or territory, crime has been in decline over the longer term. From this graph, we can see a decline in the CSI across Atlantic Canada over the past decade. The three largest Canadian provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, have also seen a decrease in the CSI in the past 10 years, including a very notable 42% decline in BC. The CSI across the Prairie provinces declined as well, though Saskatchewan and Manitoba continue to have the highest rates among the provinces. The Northern Territories consistently record higher CSI values than is the case for the rest of the country. But even here, there have been declines over the course of a decade. The most significant decrease here has been in the Yukon, even if there has been a slight increase more recently. In 2013, the CSI was stable across all of Canada's major urban centres. In fact, in that year, not a single metropolitan area observed an increase in CSI. Still, one important observation can be made here. Of the 10 Canadian urban centres with a CSI above the national average, 7 were west of Ontario, and the 2 highest were both in Saskatchewan. By this point, you're probably feeling a little overwhelmed by all the statistical evidence, but hang in there with me for a bit longer while we look at homicide rates. These are important because they will allow us to make some international comparisons. Once again, this graph clearly shows a decline in both attempted murder and homicide rates from the early 1980s onward. Murder represents less than 1% of all violent crime in Canada. Clearly, it's a relatively rare crime. In 2013, there were 505 murders in Canada, an 8% decrease from the previous year, and the lowest number recorded since 1966. But as we saw with the CSI rates generally, there is also regional variation when it comes to murder. When you examine homicide statistics by province and territory, you discover that all the provinces west of Ontario, in both Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, have homicide rates above the national average. The Yukon is exceptional. For a number of years in a row, it has actually reported no murders. Ontario and all provinces to the east are below the national average. Regina and Winnipeg, both cities in Western Canada, have the highest homicide rates in the country. Homicide rates are typically seen as perhaps the most reliable measure of violence in societies, simply because it is the crime most likely to be thoroughly investigated and accurately reported in national statistics. And certainly not a perfect measure. Statistically speaking, it may just be the best that we have. To give some sense of how Canada compares with its North American neighbors on this measure, we can look at the homicide rate per 100,000 population. A recent year, when we have good data for all three countries, is 2012. In that year, Canada had a homicide rate of 1.6, the United States had a homicide rate of 4.7, and Mexico's rate was 21.5. The American rate, then, is about 3 times that of Canada's, and of course Mexico's looks as though it's off the charts relative to the other two. We'll return to these statistics and take a closer look at these numbers in the next part of the lecture, when we address Mexico specifically. One interesting point of comparison between Canada and the US relates to guns and knives. Murders in Canada are much more likely to be stabbings than is the case in the US. 50% more likely, in fact. In the US, on the other hand, murders are far more likely to be gun-related, a whopping 440% more likely when compared with Canada. With very few exceptions, it is essentially illegal to carry a concealed handgun in Canada. Indeed, only 2.9% of Canadian households report owning a handgun. On the other side of the 49th parallel, nearly a fifth of all American households have a handgun. Gun control and a culture less inclined generally to gun ownership may well account for some of the difference in homicide rates. At the very least, it helps to explain differences in murder methods. Even as crime rates have been on the decline in Canada, the rate of incarceration has been on the rise. This coincides with a tough-on-crime agenda pursued by the Conservative government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. In 2012-13, there were just over 41,000 offenders in provincial and federal prisons. Offenders with sentences less than 24 months serve these in provincial prisons. The Canadian federal prisons are for those serving sentences greater than 24 months. By 2013, the number of inmates serving time in those federal prisons had risen to 15,000, the highest level ever, and some 3,000 more than was the case a decade earlier. To accommodate this growth, the budget for the Correctional Service of Canada, responsible for overseeing these federal prisons, grew by 40% to $2.6 billion in just 5 years. Much of this increase was directed towards building nearly 3,000 new cells. Yet, even with this prison construction boom, nearly 20% of inmates were still being double bunked in cells designed for a single prisoner. While the overall incarceration rate in Canada at 118 per 100,000 population is far, far lower than the American equivalent of 700 per 100,000, the tough-on-crime approach resulting in more and longer prison sentences certainly sounds familiar to our discussion in the last part of the lecture on the American criminal justice system. The Canadian prison system does certainly share one unenviable characteristic with its American counterpart: the disproportionate representation of visible minorities. This trend caught the attention of the Correctional Investigator of Canada, Howard Sapers, who serves as an ombudsman for federally sentenced offenders. In just the past decade, the number of visible minorities in Canadian prisons has increased by 75%. A quarter of all inmates are Aboriginal Canadians, even though they are only 4% of the Canadian population. Sapers expressed particular concern for both Black and Aboriginal inmates. He has noted, quote, "These groups are overrepresented in maximum security institutions and segregation placements. They are more likely to be subject to use of force interventions and incur a disproportionate number of institutional disciplinary charges. They are released later in their sentences and less likely to be granted day or full parole." Canadians like to imagine their country to be a peaceable kingdom. Ironically, it may well be an American folk painter, Edward Hicks, who best captured this ideal in his painting of that name, seen here. In this quite idyllic scene, we see young children at play and at peace with wild animals that might normally have eaten them. Even the livestock is calm as their predators sit idly by. One Canadian scholar, William Kilbourne, has observed that the peaceable kingdom label or metaphor seems to fit because Canada has been remarkably free of insurrection, political kidnapping, assassination, and other forms of extreme political violence. It's not as though Canada hasn't experienced these forms of violence in its history, just that it hasn't to the same degree as has been the case for other countries, even our North American neighbors. Now, when it comes to more commonplace forms of crime and violence, statistics might suggest that Canadians are better off relative to Americans and Mexicans. But we need to be cautious about such generalizations. We've also seen in this part of the lecture that there are similarities between Canada and the United States, particularly in terms of trends in incarceration and sentencing. And in the next part of the lecture, the picture will become even more complicated as we more fully consider the regional nature of crime and violence within nations as we assess this important public policy issue as it applies to Mexico. That's it for this part of the lecture, though. We'll see you in part 4. Bye for now.